Hey guys, tonight let's slow things down, dim the lights a little, put your phone face down, maybe lower the volume just enough that you almost have to listen. Tonight, we're beginning a very long, very calm story about a boy who absolutely should not have ruled the known world, and then quietly, politely, and with an alarming amount of paperwork, did exactly that. This is the story of the man who accidentally became the most powerful ruler on earth, or as history later called him, Augustus Caesar. Although for most of his early life, nobody was calling him anything impressive at all. In fact, most people were calling him that sick kid. So let's drift back to ancient Rome. Not the shiny marble Rome you're imagining. Not yet. This is the Rome of dust, noise, political backstabbing, and men loudly insisting they are definitely not kings while behaving exactly like kings. And somewhere inside this mess, a teenager with poor health, a weak voice, and zero military experience is about to inherit a problem so large it really shouldn't fit inside a human lifespan. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start where Rome itself liked to start all its good disasters, with family. Gaius Octavius was born in 63 BCE. Yes, that's 63 BCE, the same year Cicero was screaming about conspiracies, the same era where Rome was slowly realizing it had outgrown its own political system and was absolutely refusing to admit it. Octavius, no Augustus yet, we haven't earned that name, was born into a respectable family, not royal. Rome didn't do kings anymore. They were very proud of that. Still are, still lying about it. His father was a senator, a capable one, not legendary, not embarrassing, which in Roman politics already puts him ahead of most people. His mother, Attia, is where things get interesting, because Attia just happened to be the niece of Julius Caesar. Yes, that Julius Caesar, the general, the politician, the man who wrote about himself in the third person because humility was not really his brand. Now, at this point in the story, Julius Caesar is alive, ambitious, and already collecting enemies like souvenirs. But he's also childless, which in Roman elite circles is less of a tragedy and more of a mild inconvenience because adoption exists. And adoption in Rome isn't the cute, paperwork heavy process we imagine today. It's political, it's strategic, it's basically a hostile corporate takeover of someone's bloodline. But again, slow down, none of that matters yet, because young Octavius is unimpressive. He's physically weak. He gets sick constantly. He faints. He struggles with long speeches. He does not scream future world ruler. In fact, if you lined him up next to the average Roman teenage boy, strong, loud, already practicing public speeches like it's a competitive sport, Octavius looks like someone who should maybe be inside, lying down. Roman society valued strength, military service, masculine presence, a commanding voice that could shout over a crowd. Octavius had none of this. What he did have was something far more dangerous. He listened. He watched people. He remembered slights. He noticed who was loyal and who was pretending, which, to be fair, is much easier to do when everyone assumes you're harmless. And Julius Caesar noticed this. Not immediately. Caesar was busy conquering Gaul, rewriting Roman politics, and irritating the Senate so thoroughly that assassination would eventually seem like the polite solution. But whenever Caesar did see Octavius, he saw something curious, a quiet seriousness, a kid who didn't brag, didn't interrupt, didn't challenge him, which for a man with Caesar's ego was incredibly refreshing. So Caesar starts including Octavius in small ways: invitations, public appearances, letting him stand nearby during ceremonies, not center stage, just close enough to observe. And everyone else sees this and thinks, oh, that's nice. Caesar's being generous to his family. Nobody is thinking, this child is about to inherit a collapsing republic. Now, let's float gently over to Julius Caesar for a moment, because you can't understand Augustus without understanding just how massive a shadow this man cast. Caesar was not subtle. He was charming, ruthless, brilliant, and completely incapable of pretending he didn't want power. He crossed the Rubicon. He marched on Rome. He stacked offices on top of himself like achievement badges. And every time someone accused him of wanting to be king, he very calmly said no, while doing everything a king would do, except wearing a crown. The Senate hated this. The people loved him. And Rome, as always, was deeply uncomfortable with both facts at the same time. So when Caesar names Octavius as his heir, posthumously in his will, it hits Rome like a very slow, very polite explosion. But we're not there yet. Because before the knives, before the chaos, before the reading of the will, Octavius is still just a teenager trying not to collapse during public events. At one point, Caesar sends him to Greece to study, which sounds like a privilege, and it is, but it's also a test. Roman elites didn't send their future leaders to Greece for fun. They sent them to learn rhetoric, philosophy, and how to pretend to be calm while everyone around them is scheming. Octavius struggles. He's still sickly. He still doesn't look impressive. But he learns. He learns how to speak clearly without shouting, how to argue without sounding aggressive, how to wait. And waiting, as it turns out, is going to be his greatest skill. Then, of course, Caesar is murdered, because of course he is. The Ides of March, daggers, senators dramatically insisting they are saving the Republic. You already know the scene. We don't need to linger on it. This channel isn't about excitement. What matters is what happens after. Octavius is in Greece when he hears the news. Julius Caesar, his great uncle, his patron, his silent protector, is dead. And now the Roman world does something it's very good at. It panics. The will is read. And suddenly, this quiet, unimpressive teenager is named the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Not metaphorically, legally, politically, dangerously. His name changes instantly. He is now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, which is a lot of name for someone who still looks like he might faint. The Senate assumes this will be easy. He's young. He's weak. They can manage him. Mark Antony assumes this will be easy. He was Caesar's right-hand man, a general, a presence. Surely he will inherit the real power. Everyone assumes Octavius will step aside, because that's what weak boys do. Octavius does not step aside. He comes to Rome, slowly, carefully, with no army, no dramatic speeches, no threats, just a name and an inheritance. And that inheritance includes something far more valuable than money. It includes loyalty, veterans who served under Caesar, men who had been promised land, men who remembered Caesar fondly and did not trust the Senate's sudden concern for tradition. Octavius doesn't yell at them. He doesn't try to command them. He listens. He pays them, sometimes out of his own pocket. He reminds them gently who his father was, and people start to notice something unsettling. The boy everyone underestimated is not panicking. He's not rushing. He's letting other men make mistakes first. Mark Antony, for example, immediately starts acting like Mark Antony, loud, aggressive, confident that the world belongs to him. Octavius lets him. The Senate, terrified of Antony, decides to support Octavius instead, because surely this Caesar is safer, which is possibly the worst miscalculation they could have made, but they won't realize that for years. Octavius plays the role perfectly, polite, respectful, almost boring. Behind the scenes, he is building alliances, raising armies, and positioning himself as the only person who can stabilize Rome, not dominate it, just stabilize it. And Rome, exhausted by decades of civil war, is desperate for stability. So as we drift toward the end of part 1, let's pause for a moment. We have a teenager with poor health, no military reputation, surrounded by louder, stronger, more experienced men. And yet, the Senate is listening to him. The army is watching him. The people are beginning to associate him with peace, not glory, not conquest, peace, which is ironically far more powerful. In the next part, we'll watch as Octavius enters into alliances he absolutely does not intend to keep, shares power he has no intention of sharing forever, and slowly teaches Rome how to accept a monarchy without ever calling it one. For now, let your mind rest here. The sickly boy has arrived, and everyone is still underestimating him. We left our quiet, sickly teenager standing in Rome with a borrowed name, borrowed authority, and a dangerous amount of patience. Everyone around him is louder. Everyone around him thinks they're in charge. And Octavius, still not Augustus yet, is letting them think that. Because if there's one thing Rome excels at, it's underestimating people who don't shout. Now, Rome at this moment is not a calm place. It's not even pretending to be calm. It's a city full of unresolved grief, paranoia, and men with armies who are technically not supposed to have armies. Julius Caesar is dead. The Republic is allegedly saved. And nobody actually believes that for even a second. Mark Antony, Caesar's former right-hand man, is strutting around like the natural successor, which to be fair is a reasonable assumption. He has the charisma, the military record, the confidence of a man who has never been told no in a meaningful way. What he does not have is subtlety. Octavius watches this with great interest. Antony antagonizes the Senate. He grabs land. He positions himself openly as Caesar's heir without bothering with legal finesse. Octavius, meanwhile, keeps doing something deeply unsettling. He behaves. He addresses the Senate respectfully. He insists he wants to restore the Republic. He promises not to overstep, which in Roman politics is the equivalent of smiling quietly while sharpening a knife under the table. The Senate, panicking as usual, decides that Octavius is useful, a counterweight to Antony, a Caesar they can control. They grant him authority. They let him raise troops. They give him legitimacy. And Octavius accepts all of it with the same calm expression. Then, once he has what he needs, he does something very Roman. He turns on them, not dramatically, not violently, just procedurally. He marches his troops toward Rome, not in a rage, not in a spectacle, just enough to make a point. The Senate caves immediately, because Roman courage has always had limits. Octavius is named consul at the age of 19, which is not just young, it's absurd. Roman political offices had age requirements for a reason: experience, wisdom, a proven ability to survive political assassinations. Octavius skips all of it because he has soldiers, and soldiers, as it turns out, are very convincing. But even now, even holding Rome's highest office, Octavius does not rule alone. And that's important, because Rome isn't ready for another singular ruler yet, not psychologically, not politically. So Octavius does the sensible thing. He shares power, enter the second triumvirate. This is where history starts to feel like a group project gone wrong. The trio consists of Octavius, the calculating, quiet legal genius, Mark Antony, the loud, emotional general Lepidus, who is also there. Lepidus is technically important on paper. In practice, he exists mostly to fill space and later be removed gently like an unwanted chair. The triumvirate is given legal authority, not a handshake agreement, not a casual alliance, actual, official Roman law. They are granted power to restore the Republic, which is adorable because restoring the Republic apparently involves killing a lot of people. This is the era of prescriptions. Lists are drawn up, names are posted, property is confiscated, enemies of the state are quietly removed. It's ugly, it's bureaucratic, and it's extremely Roman. Octavius participates fully. This is important to remember. He is not innocent. He is not soft. He is not above the bloodshed. He is simply quieter about it. Where Antony rages and threatens, Octavius signs documents. Where others shout, Octavius lets the system do the work. One of the most famous victims is Cicero, the great orator, the defender of the Republic. Octavius allows it to happen, not because Cicero threatened him militarily, but because Cicero had mocked him, and Octavius never forgets mockery. With their enemies reduced and their power consolidated, the triumvirate divides the Roman world. Octavius takes the west, Antony takes the east, Lepidus gets Africa, which feels symbolic. For a while, the arrangement works. Antony heads east and immediately becomes distracted by wealth, by luxury, by Cleopatra. Ah, yes, Cleopatra. We're not diving deeply into her story here, but her presence matters, because Antony does what Antony always does. He falls hard. He commits emotionally. He starts making decisions based on passion rather than optics. Octavius notices. Back in Rome, Octavius is doing the opposite. He's repairing roads, settling veterans, hosting public games. Nothing flashy, nothing risky, just steady administration. Rome is tired. Tired of war, tired of drama, tired of men declaring themselves saviors. Octavius offers something radical, normalcy. Meanwhile, Antony is in Egypt, living like a Hellenistic king, surrounded by luxury and symbolism that makes Romans deeply uncomfortable. Octavius does not criticize this openly. He waits. Then, very carefully, he begins to shape a narrative. Antony, he suggests, has gone native. Antony has abandoned Roman values. Antony is under the influence of a foreign queen. This is not entirely fair, but it is extremely effective. Rome does not like the East. Rome does not like queens, and Rome especially does not like the idea that one of its leaders might be thinking about something other than Rome. Octavius releases Antony's will, which Antony probably should not have written. It includes provisions favoring Cleopatra's children, mentions of Alexandria, hints that Rome might not be the center of the world anymore. The reaction in Rome is not positive. Octavius frames the coming conflict not as a civil war, but as a war against a foreign threat, against Cleopatra, which conveniently allows Romans to pretend they are not once again killing each other over power. The war culminates at Actium, a naval battle, messy, confusing. Antony and Cleopatra flee. Octavius wins. This is the moment most people would declare victory loudly. Octavius does not. He returns to Rome calmly, methodically. Antony and Cleopatra eventually die. Tragically, dramatically. Octavius does not gloat. He mourns publicly. He honors Antony as a Roman, because dead enemies are useful, and dignified funerals make you look generous. Now finally, Octavius stands alone. No rivals, no equals. The Republic technically still exists, and this is where Octavius does something extraordinary. He gives the power back, at least, he says he does. He stands before the Senate and announces he is restoring the Republic, relinquishing his extraordinary powers, returning Rome to tradition. The Senate panics. They do not want the Republic back. They want stability. They beg him to stay, to accept authority, to guide Rome, and Octavius agrees, reluctantly, humbly, heroically. They grant him a new title, Augustus, not king, not dictator, just Augustus, revered, majestic, above politics. And Rome exhales, because the man in charge has finally stopped pretending to fight for power. He simply has it. In the next part, we'll watch Augustus build an empire that insists it is not an empire, reshape Roman life in ways people barely notice, and rule for decades without ever admitting what he truly is. For now, rest here. The wars are over. The shouting has stopped, and Rome has quietly accepted its first emperor, even though no one is allowed to say that word. Augustus would actually approve. Nothing reassured him more than a calm, compliant population that wasn't paying too much attention. When we left off, Rome had just done something very Roman. It panicked and then begged one man to stay in charge. Augustus, formerly Octavius, formerly that sick kid nobody worried about, now stands at the center of the Roman world with no serious rivals left alive. Antony is gone. Cleopatra is gone. Lepidus has been gently placed in political storage, and Rome is exhausted. Civil wars have chewed through generations. The Republic's institutions still exist, technically, but they're dented, creaking, and mostly held together by habit and nostalgia. And Augustus understands something crucial. Rome does not want a ruler, Rome wants relief. So Augustus gives them exactly that, without ever announcing what he's doing. He does not crown himself. He does not build a throne. He does not sit dramatically above the Senate. Instead, he perfects something far more effective: administrative dominance. Augustus holds multiple offices at once, carefully, legally, always with Senate approval: consul, tribune, commander of the armies. Each position, on its own, is acceptable, traditional, republican, all of them combined, make him untouchable, but he never presents it that way. He insists he is merely first among equals, a servant of the state, a caretaker, and Rome, deeply traumatized, believes him. Augustus reorganizes the military. This is important and also deeply boring, which makes it perfect for him. Before Augustus, Roman armies were loyal to generals. That's how civil wars kept happening. Augustus changes this. Soldiers are now loyal to the state, which is to say, loyal to Augustus. He creates standing legions, standard pay, retirement benefits. Nothing excites people like pensions. He settles veterans on land. He makes sure they don't riot. He keeps them busy. Peace, after all, is easier when the people who know how to fight are comfortably retired and slightly distracted. Augustus also fixes Rome's finances. Again, quietly. Taxes are standardized. Provincial governors are monitored. Corruption is reduced, not eliminated. Rome would never. But reduced enough that people notice things functioning. Roads improve, trade stabilizes, grain arrives on time, This is not glamorous, but it works, and slowly, Rome starts to associate Augustus with something it hasn't felt in decades: predictability. Now let's talk about Augustus the man, because behind this calm administrative exterior is someone who is not particularly impressive physically. He remains sickly his entire life. He suffers from chronic illnesses, digestive issues, skin problems, probably anxiety. He avoids public speaking when possible. His voice is thin. He gets tired easily. This is not the image of a conquering hero, which is again why it works. Rome has had enough heroes. Augustus presents himself as human, almost fragile, and people project stability onto him. Privately, though, Augustus is meticulous. He plans everything. He records details obsessively. He remembers insults from decades earlier. He also controls the narrative. History, poetry, and public memory are curated carefully. Writers like Virgil are encouraged to frame Rome's past as destiny, and Augustus as its inevitable conclusion. This is propaganda, of course, but it's gentle propaganda. No screaming slogans, no forced loyalty, just stories, poems, monuments. Augustus famously claims he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, which sounds dramatic. In reality, he renovated a lot, still counts. And then there's his personal life, which is not peaceful. Augustus's marriage situation is complicated. He divorces one wife while she's pregnant because politics and marries Livia. Livia is intelligent, calm, ambitious, and possibly terrifying. She becomes his partner in everything but title. Together, they present the image of traditional Roman morality, family values, discipline, virtue. Behind the scenes, Augustus's actual family is a mess. His daughter Julia is publicly disgraced for adultery. Augustus is devastated, not just emotionally, though that too, but politically. His entire moral reform campaign depends on the idea that Roman families are respectable again, and his own daughter is not cooperating. He exiles her, not quietly, publicly. Rome watches as the emperor enforces laws, even against his own blood. This reinforces his authority, but it costs him personally. Augustus becomes more withdrawn, more controlled, so he keeps going, because that's what he does. Succession becomes his greatest anxiety. Augustus does not have a surviving biological son, which is inconvenient when you've accidentally created a monarchy. He tries multiple heirs. They die, they disappoint, they fail. Eventually, he settles on Tiberius, Livia's son from a previous marriage. Tiberius is capable, experienced, also deeply unhappy. Augustus adopts him, trains him, positions him carefully. Rome is not asked whether it wants this succession. Rome is simply guided into it. By the time Augustus grows old, the system is complete. The Senate still meets. Elections still happen. Traditions still exist. But nothing moves without Augustus, and everyone knows it. He dies in 14 CE, quietly, in bed, surrounded by family. His last words are rumored to be something like, "If I've played my part well, applaud," which is very Augustus, measured, self-aware, just a little theatrical. Rome mourns him, not because he was exciting, not because he was dramatic, but because life under Augustus worked. And that might be the most dangerous legacy of all, because Rome will now spend centuries chasing stability through one-man rule, pretending it's still a republic. In the next part, we'll drift forward and watch how Augustus's system handles successors who are less subtle, less restrained, and far more emotionally unstable. For now, let your thoughts slow. The empire is calm. The paperwork is filed, and the accidental emperor has quietly reshaped the world. When we last drifted off, Augustus had done the impossible. He ruled alone, avoided the word emperor, and died peacefully in bed, which for Rome was already suspicious. But history doesn't really care how neatly you exit, it cares what you leave behind. And what Augustus leaves behind is a system, a beautifully organized, extremely delicate system that only works if the person at the top has Augustus's patience, discipline, and emotional restraint, which is unfortunate because his successors will have none of that. Augustus's greatest achievement is stability. His greatest failure is assuming his family can maintain it. They cannot. Let's begin with Tiberius. Tiberius is not Augustus's first choice, or second, or third. He is the survivor. Augustus had tried grooming multiple heirs, nephews, grandsons, promising young men who looked good in armor and behaved appropriately in public. They died of illness, of accidents, of being Roman in a politically cursed family. By the time Augustus turns to Tiberius, he is tired. Tiberius is competent. He's an experienced general. He understands administration. He also does not want the job at all. Tiberius is introverted, suspicious, emotionally withdrawn. He dislikes public life. He resents Augustus's moral expectations, and he deeply resents being forced into the role of successor. Augustus adopts him anyway, because Rome needs continuity. And so, when Augustus dies, Tiberius becomes emperor, princeps, first citizen, definitely not a king. The Senate pretends to be surprised. The army pretends to be loyal to the state. Everyone pretends this isn't hereditary monarchy. Tiberius rules cautiously at first. He respects institutions. He avoids excess. He lets the Senate function, which makes him unpopular. Romans are deeply uncomfortable with quiet authority. They prefer either inspiring leaders or obvious villains. Tiberius is neither. Over time, paranoia sets in. Accusations of treason multiply. Trials increase. Executions happen. Tiberius retreats from Rome, physically. He moves to the island of Capri. And from there, Rome imagines the worst. Stories circulate. Rumors grow. Whether they're true or not almost doesn't matter. The emperor has vanished from public life, which feels ominous. And then comes Caligula. Ah, yes, Caligula. If Augustus is the calm paperwork emperor, Caligula is what happens when absolute power meets unresolved childhood trauma. Caligula grows up surrounded by violence. His father, Germanicus, is beloved, charismatic, popular, and then he dies, suspiciously. Caligula's family members are accused, exiled, executed. He survives by staying quiet, by performing obedience, by learning when not to speak. Sound familiar? Except Caligula does not grow into Augustus. He grows into someone deeply unstable. When Tiberius dies, Caligula becomes emperor. At first, Rome is delighted. He's young, charming, the son of a hero. People hope for renewal. They are wrong. Caligula quickly descends into erratic behavior. He humiliates senators. He demands worship. He behaves unpredictably. He spends money recklessly. He enjoys watching powerful people squirm. There are stories, many stories, about madness, about cruelty, about excess. Some are exaggerated, but some are not. The line between reality and rumor blurs. But what matters is this: the system Augustus built does not stop bad emperors, it assumes good ones. And when that assumption fails, Rome suffers. Caligula is assassinated, violently, publicly. The Senate briefly imagines restoring the Republic. This lasts about 5 minutes, because the army chooses Claudius instead. Claudius, the forgotten uncle, the stuttering, limping scholar nobody took seriously, which at this point should sound familiar. Claudius survives because he is underestimated. He spends years studying history, writing books, and staying out of sight. When Caligula is murdered, Claudius is found hiding behind a curtain. The guards declare him emperor. Rome shrugs. Claudius turns out to be surprisingly effective. He expands the empire. He reforms bureaucracy. He improves administration. He also marries disastrously, multiple times. His wives manipulate him, conspire against him, possibly poison him. One of them, Agrippina, ensures her son Nero is positioned as heir. Claudius dies, conveniently, and Rome prepares for the next act. Nero begins well, young, guided by advisors, focused on culture. Then it unravels. Nero prefers performance to governance. He resents responsibility. He seeks admiration. He fears betrayal everywhere. Executions increase, spectacles intensify. Rome burns, and Nero fiddles. Probably not literally, but the image sticks. Eventually, Nero flees. He commits suicide, and with him dies the Julio Claudian dynasty. The family Augustus created destroys itself in less than a century. And that's the final irony. Augustus spent his life creating stability. He controlled everything except the future. He built a system that depended on personal restraint and handed it to people who had none. Rome will survive. The empire will continue. But the calm, careful balance Augustus achieved, that was unique, accidental, unrepeatable. So as we let this story fade out, remember the sickly teenager nobody feared, the man who ruled by patience, the emperor who never said he was emperor. He succeeded because he understood one thing. Power doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to last long enough that everyone stops questioning it. And with that, we'll let Rome settle into uneasy sleep. If you'd like to continue into another long, quiet disaster, just let me know. A city that by every reasonable historical standard should have collapsed, burned, been abandoned, or at the very least quietly forgotten sometime around the 5th century. But instead, it lingered, it shuffled forward, it filed paperwork, and it survived for 1,000 years longer than anyone expected. This is the story of Constantinople, or Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, or whatever name it happened to be using that week. And fair warning, this is not a story of epic battles, heroic charges, or exciting twists. This is a story of committees, of court intrigue so slow it feels like syrup, of emperors who spent more time arguing about theology than governing, of an empire that lived far past its expiration date, purely out of stubbornness, bureaucracy, and the occasional well-placed bribe. So let's ease into it. No rushing, no big drama. Just vibes, marble halls, and the faint sound of history refusing to die. The city starts out humbly enough, as most world-altering capitals do, as a trading post. Byzantium was founded by Greek settlers sometime around the 7th century BCE, and at first it was fine. Not amazing, not terrible, just fine. It sat on a narrow strip of land between Europe and Asia, which sounds poetic now, but at the time mostly meant it was windy, crowded, and constantly being passed through by merchants who never planned to stay. But location matters, and Byzantium's location was annoying in exactly the right way. It controlled access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which meant if you wanted to move grain, troops, or money, you eventually had to pass by it. And if you passed by it often enough, Someone was going to start charging you taxes, and the city learned very early that taxes are forever. By the time the Romans showed up, Byzantium had already been conquered, sacked, rebuilt, and mildly traumatized several times, which honestly prepared it quite well for what was coming next, because the Romans were not known for subtlety. They were known for roads, laws, and showing up uninvited. Fast forward to the 4th century CE. The Roman Empire is tired, very tired. It has grown too large. It has too many borders, too many enemies, too many emperors being murdered by their own guards, and way too many people claiming to be the rightful ruler while wearing suspiciously new armor. Rome itself, the city, is no longer ideal. It's far from the eastern frontiers, difficult to defend, and politically messy. Enter Constantine. Constantine is one of those historical figures who gets described as great, which usually means successful and terrifying. He's ambitious, he's ruthless, and he has that special Roman talent for surviving civil wars that kill everyone else. In the early 4th century, Constantine decides the empire needs a new capital, somewhere safer, somewhere richer, somewhere easier to defend. And he looks east. He looks at Byzantium. And he says, essentially, yes, this will do. In 330 CE, Constantine refounds the city as Nova Roma, New Rome, which absolutely nobody ends up calling it. Instead, it becomes Constantinople, the city of Constantine, because modesty was not a major feature of Roman leadership. Now, Constantine does not set out to create a separate empire, at least not officially. In his mind, this is still Rome, just Rome with better weather and fewer senators complaining. The city is expanded, walls are built, as palaces rise, churches appear, because Constantine is also busy reshaping Christianity into something that works nicely with imperial authority. And for a while, it's great. Constantinople is rich. It's well defended. It's plugged into trade routes that stretch across continents. And it has a front row seat to everything happening in the eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the western half of the empire is not doing great. Rome is sacked, then sacked again, then sacked in a way that really feels final. By the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire collapses entirely. Its emperors vanish, its institutions rot, and its territory fractures into a patchwork of kingdoms run by people who would really like to be Roman, but mostly aren't. And Constantinople watches all of this happen, quietly, calmly, taking notes. Here's where things get interesting, because technically, the Eastern Roman Empire does not collapse. There is no grand ending, no final emperor waving goodbye. It just continues. The emperors in Constantinople never stop calling themselves Roman. They never stop issuing Roman laws. They never stop minting Roman coins. To them, Rome didn't fall. It relocated. And honestly, that denial carries them astonishingly far. The Eastern Empire, which we will lazily call the Byzantine Empire, because historians needed a way to keep their notes organized, develops a very specific personality. It is deeply conservative, painfully bureaucratic, and obsessed with legitimacy. Everything must be documented. Everything must follow precedent. Everything must be justified with references to past emperors, laws, or obscure theological arguments. This is not an empire of bold innovation. This is an empire of, this is how we've always done it. And somehow, it works. The early Byzantine emperors inherit a world that is deeply unstable. Barbarian kingdoms press in from the west, Persian empires loomed to the east. Religious disputes split cities, families, and entire provinces. And yet, Constantinople survives. Part of that is geography. The city is protected by water on three sides. Its land walls are massive, layered, constantly repaired. Attacking Constantinople is expensive, time consuming, and often embarrassing. Another part is money. The Byzantine state is extremely good at collecting taxes, which sounds boring, and it is, but it means they can pay soldiers, repair walls, and occasionally buy off enemies, rather than fight them. Why risk a siege when you can just hand someone a chest of gold and let them go ruin someone else's countryside? Classic Byzantine move. Then there's Justinian. Justinian comes to power in the 6th century, and he is ambitious, very ambitious. He wants to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. All of it. Italy, North Africa, Spain. Because why not double down? Under Justinian, the empire expands dramatically. Generals like Belisarius reconquer lost territories with remarkable efficiency. And for a brief moment, it looks like Rome might actually be back. But here's the thing about overextending. It's expensive. It stretches resources thin, and it leaves you vulnerable. Justinian's reign is also marked by disasters. Plagues sweep through the empire, killing huge portions of the population. Riots break out in Constantinople itself, including the Nika riots, where half the city burns down because sports fans and political factions decide to merge their grievances. Justinian survives. The empire survives. Barely. By the time he dies, the empire is exhausted. The reconquests prove hard to hold, and new enemies are already knocking. Over the next few centuries, the Byzantine Empire shrinks, then stabilizes, then shrinks again. Territories are lost, regained, lost again. The empire becomes more Greek in language and culture. Latin fades. Old Roman traditions are repurposed, renamed, and wrapped in Orthodox Christianity. And through it all, Constantinople remains the heart, a city of ceremony, of rigid court ritual, of emperors who appear in carefully choreographed processions, surrounded by incense, gold, and theological symbolism. This is an empire that believes presentation matters. If you look powerful long enough, maybe reality will follow. Sometimes it does. What makes the Byzantine story so strange is not that it thrived. It often didn't. It stagnated. It struggled. It endured endless internal conflicts, coups, and dynastic disasters. Emperors were blinded, exiled, forced into monasteries, replaced by relatives who lasted anywhere from decades to a few awkward months. And yet, the system itself held. Even when emperors fell, the bureaucracy continued. The tax collectors kept collecting. The clerks kept filing. Rome lived on, quietly, stubbornly. And as we drift further into this story, we'll start to meet the people who kept this improbable state alive. The emperors who tried to reform it, the ones who nearly destroyed it, and the ones who did absolutely nothing and somehow caused the least damage. But for now, let's pause here. A city refounded by an ambitious emperor, an empire that refused to admit it was no longer Rome, and a capital that watched the world change around it without ever fully letting go of the past. If you're ready, we can continue drifting forward through iconoclasm, court conspiracies, religious meltdowns, and a city that kept surviving when it really shouldn't have. If you drifted off somewhere around Justinian, that's perfectly fine. That's actually the correct way to experience Byzantine history. You wake up, the empire is still there, slightly smaller, slightly poorer, and somehow still arguing about the same things. When we last left Constantinople, it was tired, plague tired, war tired, emotionally exhausted in the way only a very old bureaucracy can be. And this is where the Byzantine Empire really settles into its signature rhythm. Not dramatic collapse, not heroic resurgence, just long, drawn out stress. The 7th century is when things start going wrong in bulk. To the east, the old Persian enemy finally collapses after centuries of exhausting war with Rome, which sounds like good news until it isn't, because almost immediately a new force appears out of Arabia, fast, motivated, and very uninterested in Byzantine paperwork. The early Islamic caliphates expand with alarming speed. Syria falls, Egypt falls, North Africa starts slipping away. These are not minor provinces. These are rich, ancient, essential parts of the empire. And Constantinople reacts the only way it knows how, by reorganizing. The empire is carved into themes, military districts where soldiers are settled on land in exchange for service. It's efficient, practical, and very unglamorous. No triumphal marches, just farmers who are also soldiers, quietly defending what's left. And again, it works. Not perfectly, but well enough. Constantinople survives sieges, massive ones. Arab armies surround the city. Fleets block the sea, and the city holds, thanks to walls and supply lines, and a delightful invention known as Greek fire, a substance that burns on water and absolutely terrifies anyone seeing it for the first time. The Byzantines never share the recipe, because of course they don't. As the external pressure increases, internal stress starts to show in creative ways. Which brings us to one of the empire's most soothingly bizarre obsessions: icons, religious images, painted saints, mosaics of Christ, holy portraits everywhere. For centuries, icons are a normal part of worship. People pray before them, kiss them, carry them into battle, and then some emperors decide this is a problem. Enter the iconoclasts. Iconoclasm is the belief that religious images are idolatrous and offensive to God, which is already a bold stance when your capital city is essentially one giant art gallery of saints. In the 8th century, emperors begin banning icons. They are removed from churches, destroyed, painted over. Monks are furious. The public is confused. Riots break out. And the empire spends over a century arguing about whether it is acceptable to paint Jesus. This is not an exaggeration. Entire reigns are consumed by theological debates, so specific and so intense that they split families, provinces, and political alliances. Some emperors enforce iconoclasm aggressively, others quietly reverse it. Then the next emperor reverses the reversal. At one point, the empire officially restores icons. There is a big celebration. Everyone agrees this issue is settled forever. It is not. But eventually, icons win, mostly because the population never stopped liking them. And that tells you something important about Byzantium. Even emperors couldn't push too hard against tradition. The system resisted change, sometimes violently, sometimes passively. Mostly, it just waited people out. While all this theological arguing is happening, the imperial court continues its slow, ceremonial existence. Byzantine emperors do not rule like Western kings. They rule like sacred figures. They are dressed in elaborate robes. They appear rarely. When they do, it is staged. Foreign ambassadors are led through halls filled with mechanical lions, golden trees, and automata that sing, because intimidation through spectacle is cheaper than war. And honestly, kind of charming. But behind the curtains, things are tense. Succession is never smooth. There is no clear rule. Emperors are overthrown with alarming regularity. Some are assassinated, some are blinded, because blinding someone technically makes them unfit to rule without killing them, which feels very Byzantine. Some are sent to monasteries, where they live quietly, bitterly, and very much alive. The throne is not inherited so much as temporarily occupied. And yet, despite all this instability, the empire experiences moments of revival. In the ninth and 10th centuries, under the Macedonian dynasty, Byzantium stabilizes, territories are reclaimed, the economy improves, art flourishes, learning returns, law codes are revised. For a while, it feels like a gentle renaissance. Emperors like Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, which is not very sleepy, expand imperial power and assert control. But even Basil, for all his success, leaves no clear heir, and the system slips again. This is the pattern now: strength, stagnation, recovery, internal decay, on repeat. By the 11th century, cracks widen. The empire has money but less land. It has ceremony but fewer soldiers. It increasingly relies on mercenaries, which is always a sign things are getting complicated. And then comes 1071, the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantines face the Seljuk Turks in eastern Anatolia. The battle goes badly, very badly. The emperor is captured, the army collapses, and Anatolia, the empire's heartland, begins to slip away. This is not the end, but it is a turning point. The empire is now fragile in a way it hasn't been before, and so, in a move that will have consequences, Byzantine emperors look west for help. They appeal to Latin Christian powers, to the Pope, to Western knights, which brings us, slowly and gently, toward the Crusades. Now, the First Crusade begins as a response to Byzantine requests. Technically, the emperor expects a manageable number of professional soldiers. What he gets instead is a massive, chaotic flood of armed pilgrims. They march through Byzantine territory. They loot. They argue. They are difficult guests. Still, the Byzantines manage the situation. They guide the Crusaders east. They recover some territory. And for a moment, cooperation exists, but trust never fully forms. The Latins think the Byzantines are arrogant, sneaky, and insufficiently pious. The Byzantines think the Latins are loud, crude, and terrifyingly unrefined. Both sides are correct. As centuries pass, relations worsen. The Byzantine Empire weakens further. Economic power shifts. Italian merchant cities dominate trade. Constantinople becomes dependent on foreign merchants who pay reduced taxes, which is never a healthy dynamic. And then, 1204 happens, the Fourth Crusade, originally intended to go to Egypt because plans matter. Instead, due to debt, politics, and poor decision-making, the Crusaders turn on Constantinople itself. They sack the city. A Christian army sacks the greatest Christian city in the East. Churches are looted, relics are stolen, art is destroyed. It is devastating culturally, psychologically. The empire fractures. A Latin empire is declared. Byzantine successor states scatter. Constantinople is no longer the unquestioned center, and yet, because this is Byzantium, the empire returns. In 1261, a Byzantine ruler recaptures Constantinople. The empire is restored, but it is not the same. The city is poorer, smaller, damaged. The walls still stand. The ceremonies resume. The emperors still wear purple, but the world has moved on. And this is where we'll gently pause again. an empire that survived barbarian invasions, plagues, theological civil wars, and centuries of pressure, now weakened by allies, debt, and internal exhaustion, still standing, still calling itself Roman, still refusing to admit the obvious. In the next part, we'll drift into the final centuries, the slow fading, the desperate diplomacy, and the last emperors ruling more in memory than reality. Whenever you're ready, if you've stayed with me this far, congratulations. You've outlasted several Byzantine emperors already, and much like them, you may be a little tired, slightly confused, and wondering how this whole thing is still going. When we last left Constantinople, it had been sacked by fellow Christians, resurrected out of sheer stubbornness, and reinstalled as the capital of an empire that technically existed, but mostly in spirit. The city was back in Byzantine hands after 1261. The ceremonies resumed, the titles returned, the imperial court dusted itself off, straightened its robes, and pretended nothing irreversible had happened, which is very on brand. But this final Byzantine Empire, the one after the Latin occupation, is a ghost of its former self. It controls little more than Constantinople itself, a few nearby territories, and some scattered lands in Greece. The vast provinces that once fed the empire are gone. The treasury is thin, the population is smaller, and yet the emperors still call themselves Basileus of the Romans, because giving up the title would feel worse than losing the land. By the late 13th and 14th centuries, the empire's greatest skill is diplomacy, not strength, not conquest, as though just talking. Byzantine emperors become masters of negotiation, marriage alliances, religious compromise, and gentle pleading. They play rivals against each other. They send envoys everywhere. They promise church union to the West in exchange for military help. They promise trade privileges to Italian city-states in exchange for survival. The empire is no longer a superpower. It's a very old, very polite negotiator trying to keep the lights on. And this works for a while, but while Byzantium is shrinking, something else is growing. To the east, a new power rises in Anatolia, the Ottomans. At first, they're just one of many Turkish groups, a small frontier state. Nothing special. Byzantium has seen dozens of these come and go. But the Ottomans are patient. They expand slowly, methodically. They absorb territory piece by piece, city by city. And crucially, they learn. They learn from Byzantine administration, from Persian governance, from Islamic tradition. They build a state that is flexible, military-focused, and far less sentimental about the past, which makes them extremely dangerous to an empire that lives almost entirely in memory. By the 14th century, the Ottomans surround Constantinople on nearly all sides. The city becomes an island, not geographically, but politically. Inside the walls, life continues. Markets operate, churches hold services, scholars debate theology and ancient texts, court rituals continue, unchanged. Outside the walls, the world belongs to someone else. This is one of the strangest aspects of Byzantium's final centuries. The contrast. Inside the city, ancient Rome, preserved in incense and protocol. Outside the city, cannons, gunpowder, and a very modern kind of warfare. And yes, cannons matter. For centuries, Constantinople's walls were unbeatable, layered, massive, repaired endlessly. They had stopped Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, Crusaders, but they were designed for a world before gunpowder artillery. And the Ottomans bring cannons, huge ones, custom built, financed with serious money. There is something deeply unfair about this. After surviving 1,000 years of chaos, the city finally meets a technology it cannot outlast through stubbornness alone. The last Byzantine emperors know this. They are not delusional. They can see the writing on the wall and on the cannon barrels. They send desperate appeals to Western Europe, to the Pope, to kings. They offer church union again. They promise loyalty. They promise anything. Some help arrives. A little, a few thousand soldiers, a handful of ships, not enough. Because Western Europe is busy, fighting its own wars, arguing with itself. And because Constantinople by now feels less like a vital ally and more like a beautiful relic. By 1453, the situation is grim. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, is young, ambitious, and very determined to take Constantinople. The city's population has dwindled dramatically. Large sections inside the walls are farmland or abandoned neighborhoods. The defenders number only a few thousand. They are brave, but they are very outnumbered. And the walls are still impressive, but the cannons begin their work day after day. Boom, pause, boom. Stone that has stood for centuries begins to crack. Inside the city, there's prayer. There are processions. There are final attempts at unity between Orthodox and Catholic Christians. And there is resignation. The last emperor, Constantine the 11th, knows what is coming. He refuses to flee, because if Byzantium ends, it will end with its emperor inside the city. Not running, not negotiating, just present. On May 29th, 1453, Constantinople falls. The Ottomans breach the walls. The defenders are overwhelmed. The emperor disappears into the fighting. His body is never conclusively identified, which somehow feels appropriate. There is no dramatic last speech recorded, no theatrical ending, just silence. After more than 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire ends not with a bang, but with exhaustion. And yet, this is not a clean ending, because Constantinople does not vanish. It becomes Istanbul. The Ottomans make it their capital. They preserve much of the city. They adapt it. Churches become mosques. Palaces are repurposed. The city lives on. Roman law influences Ottoman administration. Byzantine scholars flee west, bringing ancient texts that help fuel the Renaissance. In a strange way, Byzantium survives its own death, just elsewhere. What makes the Byzantine Empire so quietly fascinating is not its glory or its battles, it's its refusal to stop. For 1,000 years, it adapted, compromised, rebranded, and reinterpreted itself. It lost land, it lost power, it lost relevance, but it never lost its sense of continuity. To the very end, its rulers believed they were Roman, that the empire still existed, that tomorrow might look like yesterday again. Of course it didn't, but there's something deeply human about trying anyway. And that's where we'll let this story rest. A city that should have collapsed, an empire that refused to admit it had, and 1,000 years of survival built not on heroics, but on paperwork, ritual, stubbornness, and denial. If you've drifted off by now, that's perfect. If you're still awake, honestly, impressive. Either way, thank you for staying with me through this very long, very quiet story. And whenever you're ready, we can always drift into another royal disaster. This is the story of an entire civilization that spent centuries building cities, roads, temples, and complicated water systems, only to one day decide very calmly that it was time to go. And then they did. No note, no goodbye, no forwarding address, just empty houses, silent streets, and a lot of confused future archaeologists muttering, okay, but why though? So settle in, breathe slowly, and let's drift back to a place that was once one of the largest cities on Earth and then wasn't. If you were standing in the jungles of Southeast Asia around the year 1100, you would not be standing in a jungle. You would be standing in a city, a very large one, a very organized one, and an extremely confident one. This was Angkor, capital of the Khmer Empire, a city so spread out and carefully engineered that for centuries historians didn't even realize it was a city. They thought it was just a bunch of temples randomly tossed into the forest, which is fair because nature did eventually swallow the whole thing like it was a light snack. But before the vines moved in, Angkor was enormous. We're talking roads, reservoirs, canals, neighborhoods, rice paddies laid out like a spreadsheet. At its peak, Angkor may have supported close to 1 million people, which in medieval terms is basically saying, yes, this place was a logistical nightmare, and somehow it worked. And it worked because the Khmer rulers were obsessed, deeply obsessed with water, which honestly is not the worst obsession a medieval king could have. The Khmer Empire rose slowly, methodically, and with very little drama at first, which already makes it suspicious. By the 9th century, Khmer kings had figured out that controlling water meant controlling everything. Rice needed water, people needed rice, armies needed fed people, and kings needed everyone else to stay calm and compliant. So they built reservoirs the size of small seas. These weren't decorative ponds. These were massive engineered systems called barrays, designed to store water during monsoons and release it during dry seasons. It was ancient civil engineering on hard mode, and the Khmer rulers absolutely loved it. They didn't just rule, they managed, and because they managed well, Angkor flourished. Temples rose, markets buzzed, monks wandered quietly, royal processions went by with the usual amount of gold, elephants, and divine confidence. Everything was orderly, predictable, stable, which historically speaking is when you should start worrying. The kings of Angkor were not shy people. They believed they were divinely sanctioned rulers, chosen to maintain cosmic balance between heaven and earth, which is a very calming belief if you're the king, and mildly concerning if you're anyone else. Each ruler built temples not just as religious centers, but as monuments to themselves, because nothing says humility like carving your face into stone and calling it divine. Angkor Wat, the most famous of these temples, wasn't just a place of worship, it was a statement, a carefully planned cosmic diagram turned into architecture. Every tower, corridor, and carving was designed to reflect the universe itself, and the universe, according to the king, revolved around him. Of course it did. For centuries, this system worked beautifully. Water flowed, rice grew, trade passed through, the empire expanded and contracted like a slow, relaxed breath, and the people stayed. Generation after generation grew up assuming Angkor was permanent, that the canals would always flow, that the kings would always maintain the balance, that the city would always be there when they woke up, which is exactly the kind of assumption history loves to punish. Because sometime around the 13th century, things began to wobble, not collapse, not explode, just wobble. The climate shifted, Monsoon patterns became less predictable. Sometimes there was too much rain, overwhelming the canals. Sometimes there was too little, leaving reservoirs dry. The water system, once Angkor's greatest strength, became incredibly fragile. It had been designed for consistency. Nature decided to stop cooperating, and instead of adapting quickly, the system struggled. Repairs were slow, canals silted up, reservoirs cracked, and each small failure made the next one worse. This wasn't dramatic, it was administrative, which is somehow more unsettling. Meanwhile, the royal court did what royal courts do best. They argued, they built more temples, they rearranged power structures, they doubled down. New kings shifted religious priorities. Hindu rulers gave way to Buddhist ones. Temples were repurposed. Symbols changed. The spiritual tone softened, but infrastructure doesn't care about theology. Water still needed managing. Rice still needed growing. People still needed eating. And slowly, quietly, the cracks widened. Now here's the important part. There was no single catastrophic event, no final siege, no giant earthquake, no moment where everyone screamed and ran for the exits. Instead, people began leaving, one household at a time. Maybe a farmer noticed the irrigation wasn't reliable anymore. Maybe a family followed trade routes south toward more stable regions. Maybe monks relocated to newer religious centers. They didn't flee, they migrated, and migration doesn't leave dramatic ruins, it leaves empty space. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Angkor was thinning out. The elite had already shifted political power elsewhere. The capital quietly moved. Royal attention drifted south toward areas closer to maritime trade. And without the court, without constant maintenance, the water system decayed faster. Canals clogged, fields flooded or dried, neighborhoods emptied. The city didn't fall. It exhaled and never inhaled again. And this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling, because people didn't leave everything behind. They took valuables, they took tools, they took religious objects. What they left were the buildings, homes with no signs of struggle, temples with unfinished carvings, roads that simply stopped being used. It's as if everyone agreed, without meeting, without writing it down, that Angkor was no longer worth the effort, and one by one, they walked away. Centuries passed. The jungle moved in with the patience of something that knows it will win eventually. Roots cracked stone, vines climbed towers, trees grew out of rooftops like they'd always belonged there. By the time European explorers stumbled upon Angkor in the 19th century, they were baffled. Who built this? Why here? Where did everyone go? And the most disturbing answer was also the simplest. They left because it stopped working. No drama, no apocalypse, just the slow failure of a system that required perfection to survive. And here's the sleepy irony. Angkor didn't disappear because its people were foolish. It disappeared because they were practical. They didn't cling to a dying city out of pride. They didn't sacrifice generations trying to force it to survive. They adapted, which is somehow the least dramatic ending imaginable, and also one of the most human. So as we drift forward in time, keep this image in your mind. A city at dusk, canals quiet, temples still standing, no panic, no alarms, just doors closing, footsteps fading, and the soft sound of history being politely abandoned. Let's float onward, because Angkor was not the only place where this happened, and the next civilization did it even more mysteriously. When you're ready, Just let me know. Maybe shift the pillow a little, because now we're drifting across the ocean, across centuries, and into another civilization that did everything right until it didn't. And just like Angkor, the Maya did not collapse with a bang. They didn't go out screaming. They didn't even bother leaving a decent explanation. They just stopped showing up. If you could time travel to the Maya lowlands around the year 700, you would find yourself surrounded by confidence. Not loud confidence, quiet confidence, mathematical confidence. This was a civilization that tracked the stars obsessively, built cities aligned with celestial events, and invented calendars so accurate that people are still arguing about them today, which is impressive considering they were doing advanced astronomy without metal tools, beasts of burden, or wheels, just vibes, math, and an intense commitment to stone. The Maya were not one empire, they were many city states: Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, each with its own ruler, its own dynastic drama, and its own collection of very serious stone monuments, reminding everyone who was in charge. Kings were everywhere, egos were enormous. Stelae, giant carved stone slabs, were put up constantly to commemorate birthdays, victories, rituals, and the occasional "yes, I'm still king" reminder. It was exhausting, honestly. Maya rulers loved to record time. Dates mattered deeply. Cycles mattered even more. They tracked not just years, but cosmic eras spanning thousands of years. Time wasn't linear, it looped, repeated, restarted, which sounds philosophical until you realize how stressful that must have been. Every ritual had to happen on the right date. Every ceremony had to align with the cosmos. Every king had to prove he was maintaining balance, because if he wasn't, well, clearly the gods would notice. And when gods notice things, kings get nervous. Maya cities were dense, complex, and deeply tied to agriculture. Maize was everything. Water was everything. Rain was everything. And once again, because history has a sense of humor, climate began to shift. Long droughts arrived, rain became unreliable, reservoirs dried, which is a problem when your civilization depends on predictable weather and ritual reassurance that the gods are happy. Spoiler, the gods were not sending rain. Now here's where Maya history gets quietly uncomfortable. When droughts worsened, kings didn't adapt quickly. They doubled down, more rituals, more bloodletting, more monuments. Because obviously, if the gods aren't responding, the solution is to try harder. Kings pierced their tongues, queens bled ceremonially, captives were paraded and sacrificed, all very dramatic and extremely ineffective at making it rain. Meanwhile, the people noticed something. The elites still lived well, the temples still rose, the monuments still went up, but crops failed, water vanished, labor demands increased, and faith began to wobble. Because when your king claims divine authority and then fails to deliver rain for a decade, it creates a bit of a branding issue. Around the 8th and ninth centuries, inscriptions started changing. Dates stopped appearing. Stelae stopped being carved. Kings stopped announcing things, which is not a good sign for a culture obsessed with recording time. It wasn't that writing disappeared, it just trailed off, like a sentence that never quite reaches the period. People didn't revolt en masse. They didn't storm palaces. They left. Families relocated toward more stable regions. Trade routes shifted north and toward the coast. Smaller communities replaced massive urban centers. Cities emptied gradually. Tikal didn't burn. Copan wasn't destroyed. They simply ran out of people willing to live there. And once again, archaeology tells us something eerie. Homes were abandoned cleanly, tools were taken, valuables removed, no signs of chaos, no mass graves, just empty plazas where rituals used to happen on schedule. By the time the Spanish arrived centuries later, the Maya were still there, still farming, still speaking their languages, still practicing traditions. But the great cities, gone, overgrown, forgotten. The civilization didn't die. The lifestyle did, which is arguably more unsettling. And then there's the calendar, because of course there is. Modern panic over the Maya apocalypse missed the point entirely. The calendar didn't predict the end of the world, it tracked cycles, endings that led to beginnings. The real ending had already happened, quietly, gradually, without permission from the calendar at all. So now, as we drift forward, notice the pattern. No dramatic final moment, no singular disaster, just systems stretched too tightly, elites disconnected from reality, climate refusing to cooperate, and people choosing calmly to go somewhere else. Let's keep floating. Because next, we're heading somewhere colder, where stone cities stood at impossible heights, and where abandonment came with snow instead of vines. If you ask most people what Machu Picchu was, they'll say something like the Inca capital, which is understandable. It looks important. It sits dramatically on a mountain ridge. It has terraces, temples, and stones fitted so perfectly they make modern masonry feel insecure. But Machu Picchu was not a capital. It wasn't even a regular city. It was complicated, which in Inca terms is saying something. The Inca Empire was young, shockingly young. It rose rapidly in the 15th century, expanding faster than anyone expected, mostly because they were extremely organized and absolutely relentless. They didn't use money. They didn't have writing as we think of it. They didn't use wheels for transport. What they did have was bureaucracy, a lot of it, census taking, record keeping with knotted strings called quipu, mandatory labor systems, state managed food storage, which meant that, unlike Angkor or the Maya, the Inca were very good at logistics, almost too good. Inca cities weren't organic, they were planned. Every settlement had a purpose: administrative, military, religious. People didn't live where they wanted, they lived where they were assigned. And Machu Picchu, that wasn't for regular people, that was elite. Machu Picchu was likely a royal estate, a seasonal retreat, a ceremonial space, think less bustling city, and more imperial vacation compound, which immediately explains why it was abandoned so cleanly. You don't evacuate a vacation home with panic. You just stop going. The Inca ruler most associated with Machu Picchu is Pachacuti, and yes, his name translates roughly to world shaker, because of course it does. Pachacuti expanded the empire aggressively, reorganized society, and introduced large-scale infrastructure projects. He was efficient, visionary, and absolutely convinced the gods were on his side. He built Machu Picchu not because he needed it, but because he could. And for a while, it worked. But Inca society had a problem. It relied heavily on centralized authority. When the system functioned, everything flowed smoothly. When it didn't, it fell apart fast. And then, something extremely inconvenient happened. Europeans arrived. Now, technically, this part involves conquest and disease, which we are going to treat very gently. No gore, no drama, just consequences. Smallpox arrived before the Spanish did. It spread silently. It killed the emperor, which is not ideal for an empire built around one central ruler. A civil war followed. Two brothers fought for the throne. The bureaucracy fractured. Trust evaporated. And suddenly, cities that relied on central coordination stopped receiving attention. Machu Picchu, tucked away in the mountains, was simply abandoned, not destroyed, not looted heavily, just left. And here's the strange thing: there's no evidence of a final moment. No defensive structures rushed into place, no mass burials, no scorched earth. The caretakers left. The elites stopped visiting. The system moved on. Nature stepped in. Stone structures stayed intact. Terraces held. The jungle crept closer, but never fully consumed it. And Machu Picchu waited for centuries, invisible. Unlike Angkor or the Maya cities, Machu Picchu wasn't forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because it was no longer useful, which might be the most brutally practical reason of all. So now we've seen three versions of the same story: a water-based megacity that stopped working, astronomical city-states that lost faith in their kings, a mountain estate abandoned when its owner's world collapsed. Different places, different cultures, same ending. People left. Let's drift one last time, because our final stop takes us far north, where stone cities met ice, and where leaving was not a choice, but a necessity. If you're already half asleep, perfect. We're heading north now, very north, past forests, past farmland, into a place where survival required optimism bordering on delusion. This is the story of the Norse settlers in Greenland, and how they didn't so much leave as slowly run out of options. Around the year 985, a man named Eric the Red arrived in Greenland, which is already a questionable decision. Eric was an Icelandic exile. He had been kicked out for killing people, which in medieval Scandinavia means you were really pushing it. So naturally, he sailed west and found a massive island covered mostly in ice. And because marketing has always mattered, he called it Greenland, because of course he did. Eric convinced settlers to come with promises of pasture land and opportunity, and for a while, it actually worked. The climate was relatively mild. Grass grew in sheltered valleys. Cattle grazed. Sheep survived. The Norse built farms. They built churches. They brought European lifestyles to the edge of the Arctic, which is impressive and deeply stubborn. The Greenland Norse were committed to being European. They raised livestock instead of relying on fishing. They wore wool instead of adapting Inuit furs. They built stone churches instead of flexible shelters. They clung to identity, which sounds noble until the climate changed. Around the 13th century, the Little Ice Age began. Temperatures dropped, seasons shortened, sea ice increased, farming became harder, trade routes froze, and the Greenland Norse refused to adapt. They continued raising cattle even when it made no sense. They ignored seal hunting techniques used by the Inuit. They kept building churches while food became scarce. Faith over function, identity over survival. Slowly, settlements thinned, farms were abandoned, churches fell silent, burials show signs of malnutrition. And then the record stops. No letters, no final message, no dramatic last stand, just absence. When Europeans returned centuries later, the Norse were gone, not integrated, not relocated en masse, just gone. And the Inuit remained because they adapted. And here's the quiet lesson tying all of this together: civilizations don't usually end in fire, They end in maintenance failures, in leadership stubbornness, in climate shifts, in people choosing to leave or being unable to stay. Angkor failed because it couldn't adapt its water system. The Maya left because kings clung to rituals over reality. The Inca abandoned cities when central power collapsed. The Norse disappeared because identity mattered more than survival. Different paths, same ending. So as we fade out tonight, picture these places not as ruins, but as pauses. Cities waiting, stones holding their breath, paths overgrown but still there. History doesn't always slam doors. Sometimes it just doesn't come back. Thanks for being here. Thanks for drifting along. And if you're still awake, don't worry. You don't need to remember names. If you fall asleep halfway through a sentence about medieval paperwork, that's actually the correct outcome. Tonight, we begin with a man who did not want to change the world. A man who did not want a revolution. A man who mostly wanted everyone to stop yelling at him about his soul. This is the story of Martin Luther, a deeply anxious monk, a professional overthinker, and somehow the boring clerk who accidentally ended the Middle Ages. Now, before we get started, just remember, nothing explodes, no armies charge, no dragons, just guilt, ink, and a truly unreasonable amount of theology. So let's drift back, way back, to late 15th century Germany, which, despite the name, was not a country. It was more like a collection of squabbling neighborhoods that all agreed to be confusing at the same time. Martin Luther was born in 1483 in a small town called Eisleben. His parents were not royalty. This is already a problem for medieval history. They were ordinary people, hardworking, ambitious, and absolutely determined that their son would do better than they did. His father, Hans Luther, worked his way up from peasant roots into the respectable world of mining and metal refining, which in the 15th century meant you were allowed to have opinions. Hans wanted Martin to be a lawyer, a respectable profession, a clean profession, a profession that did not involve starving in a monastery while arguing with God at 3 in the morning. Martin, as a child, was intense, not in a charming way, in a this kid is thinking too much again way. He grew up in a world where God was everywhere, watching, judging, keeping notes. This was not the warm, friendly God of inspirational posters. This was medieval God, a cosmic accountant with infinite memory and zero tolerance for mistakes. And young Martin took this very seriously. Too seriously. Painfully seriously. He was sent to school, then to university. He studied law because his father said so, and because at the time, saying no to your father was not a popular lifestyle choice. Martin was good at school, annoyingly good. The kind of student who doesn't just memorize the rules, but worries about whether he's breaking them accidentally by existing incorrectly. But then, one day in 1505, while traveling near the town of Stotternheim, Martin Luther was caught in a thunderstorm. Now, medieval thunderstorms were not calming background noise. They were loud. They were terrifying. They were interpreted as extremely personal messages from God. Lightning struck nearby. Martin panicked, and in a moment of pure terror, he did what many stressed people have done throughout history. He made a dramatic promise he would later regret. He cried out to Saint Anne, the patron saint of miners, which is a very specific saint for a very specific anxiety. And he promised that if he survived, he would become a monk. He survived, and unfortunately for everyone involved, He kept the promise. His father was furious, absolutely livid. Years of planning, years of tuition, all so his son could go join a monastery and argue with God professionally. Martin entered the Augustinian monastery at Erfurt, and this is where things really start to slow down, which is perfect. Monastic life was quiet, structured, and deeply uncomfortable if you were Martin Luther, because Martin did not find peace in the monastery. He found more things to worry about. He fasted a lot. He prayed constantly. He confessed obsessively. Not normal confession, not I snapped at someone confession. We're talking hours long confession sessions where he would return 5 minutes later because he remembered another thought he might have had. His superiors were exhausted. Martin was terrified of sin, not just actions, thoughts, accidental thoughts, thoughts about whether he had the wrong thoughts. He was convinced that no matter how hard he tried, he could never be good enough for God, which, to be fair, is not a relaxing belief system. Eventually, his mentors did what any reasonable medieval authority figure would do. They gave him more work. Martin was sent to study theology, because clearly what this anxious man needed was deeper immersion in divine judgment. He was ordained as a priest in 1507. His first Mass was not great. He reportedly froze at the altar, overwhelmed by the idea that he was standing in the presence of God, hands shaking, voice trembling, which is not ideal when you're supposed to be calmly performing sacred rituals. Still, he persisted. He studied Scripture. He read the Bible obsessively, in Latin, slowly, carefully. And here's where something important happened, something very boring and very dangerous. Martin started noticing things. Specifically, he noticed that the Bible did not always say what the church said it said. Now, to be clear, the medieval Catholic Church was not subtle. It was powerful. It was wealthy. It was deeply invested in its own authority. And one of its favorite fundraising tools was indulgences. Indulgences were, in theory, reductions in punishment for sins. In practice, they often sounded a lot like, give us money and your dead relatives suffer less. This was extremely popular. It raised huge sums. It funded cathedrals. It funded art. It funded very comfortable lives for people who were not monks sleeping on straw mats. One particular indulgence campaign was being run by a man named Johann Tetzel. Tetzel was enthusiastic. He traveled around preaching about indulgences with catchy slogans, the most famous being, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, which is horrifying, but also annoyingly memorable. Martin Luther did not like this, not because he hated money. He just hated the idea that salvation could be purchased. He believed, after much internal suffering, that salvation came through faith alone, not works, not payments, not paperwork, which ironically would lead to a truly unbelievable amount of paperwork. By 1517, Martin was a professor at the University of Wittenberg. He taught theology. He lectured. He argued with himself constantly. And eventually, he snapped. In the quiet academic sense, on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther wrote a list. Because of course he did. 95 points, 95 theses, complaints, observations, academic discussion prompts. This was not a revolutionary manifesto. This was a bored, frustrated professor saying, I have some questions. He criticized indulgences. He questioned papal authority. He suggested that repentance was a lifelong process, not a transaction. And then he did the most accidentally dramatic thing in history. He nailed the list to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, which sounds aggressive, but was actually just how you posted notices at the time. This was the medieval version of a bulletin board. Martin did not expect much to happen. He wanted a debate, a discussion, some letters. Instead, the printing press happened. Someone printed the theses, then someone else printed them again, then translated them into German. And suddenly, Martin Luther was everywhere, which is the last thing an anxious monk wants. The church was not pleased at all. At first, they tried to ignore him. Then they tried to correct him. Then they tried to threaten him. Martin responded by writing more pamphlets, books, letters. The man who believed salvation was not about works produced an absolutely heroic amount of written material. He argued that the Pope could be wrong, which was not a popular opinion if you enjoyed not being on fire. In 1520, the Pope issued a bull, which is a document, not an animal, although both are equally stubborn, threatening Luther with excommunication unless he recanted. Martin responded calmly by burning it publicly, which was, how do we put this, not de-escalation. In 1521, Martin was summoned to the Diet of Worms, which is a meeting, not a meal. He stood before the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and was asked to recant his writings. Martin, exhausted, anxious, and very done, reportedly said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," which is the kind of sentence that ends careers. He was declared an outlaw. Anyone could legally kill him, which really puts a damper on your teaching schedule. Fortunately, he was secretly kidnapped by friends, and because history is weird, he was hidden in Wartburg Castle. There he grew a beard, translated the Bible into German, and argued with the devil, allegedly by throwing ink at the wall. This is what passes for quiet productivity in the 16th century. And here's the thing, Martin never intended to start Protestantism. He never intended to split Christendom. He just wanted clarity, and maybe less yelling. Instead, Europe fractured, wars followed, kings used his ideas when convenient, and ignored them when not. And the Middle Ages slowly, awkwardly, came to an end, not with a bang, but with a monk and a list. Of course it was paperwork, and that's where we'll gently pause for tonight. In the next part, we'll drift into what happened after Luther accidentally broke Christianity, including the rulers who used his ideas, the chaos they unleashed, and the many, many ways this did not make anyone calmer. If you'd like to continue, just let me know, and we'll pick up right where medieval certainty quietly fell apart, and that's where we'll leave things tonight. The candles are low, the paperwork is finally closed, and Martin Luther is, for once, not arguing with anyone. If your eyes are already closed, that's perfect. If you're still listening, don't worry. Nothing important is about to happen. History will still be here tomorrow. The monks will keep worrying. The kings will keep making bad decisions. For now, just let your thoughts slow down. Let the names blur together. Let the dates drift away. Thank you for spending part of your night here. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to finish the story. Just rest. Just breathe. Good night. And I'll see you quietly next time.